Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Jared, and I am with the Grace Company Canada. I go to a bunch of different quilt shows when there is quilt shows. So I do a little bit of sales. I run classes at different stores, which I've done across Western Canada and parts of Ontario. And then I also am responsible for the tech support. So if you call with a problem, then you probably end up talking to me. So this is our last presentation of day 3 of Quilt Canada, our presentation on frequently asked questions about tension, which is going to be presented by the Grace team. So if you already have a long arm quilting machine or a Qunique quilting machine, definitely stick around for the presentation. I'm sure it's going to be super insightful. I know tension is always one of those demons that I struggle with, and it's important to get the information from the right source. So I'm so grateful that they've been willing to do this presentation for us. So let me pass over to them. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments, or of course you can call us on our toll-free number. So if you have questions that aren't answered in the video, just reach out and we are happy to help. There we go. Let's switch over to the presentation and we'll see what we learn. I'm excited.
I'm Cody. I've been with Grace Company since 2010, and I have been around since our very first sewing machines, and it's very great. And I just want to share that I have a lot of passion about quilting, and I love our customers, and they've been so much fun interacting with you guys and being able to share these experiences and watching the beautiful quilts that you guys have made is inspiring to me. And I spend a lot of time testing and working with machines, making sure that they all work perfectly. But I also like stitching and making quilts with my mom. We have a lot of fun making quilts and being able to, she'll piece them together and then I'll quilt them out and set the tension and be able to create this wonderful, beautiful texture as we piece these quilts together and finish up the quilts. And it's a wonderful experience that I truly enjoy. I also have Alyssa here with me to talk to you guys a little bit about our sewing machines and getting started with what first steps you should take when you are setting up and getting started with quilting.
So, hi, I'm Alyssa. Like Nathan said, I recently joined Carla's team in education. I'm also still working a little bit in accounts receivable, so you've probably heard from me on both sides. I've been here with the Grace Company for about 8 months. I started in accounting in the financial department, and now I'm in education. So I love education. Coming into this as someone who's sewn pretty much my whole life, I've pieced several quilt tops, and it's been fun to see the other side of that. You know, growing up when I'd piece a quilt top or I'd help my mom with one, you know, she'd send it to the quilter, you know, our friend, and it would come back and we'd bind it, and we never really knew what happened on the other side of that transaction. So now I get to kind of see some of the things that happen on your side of it, on the quilting side of it, and to hear your stories and help you find answers to questions that you have. I'm relatively new to this quilting world, but people like Carla, Cody, and so many other people here are helping me learn so much every day. I love hearing your stories, love talking to you guys, and I'm super excited to learn about tension with you guys today. Cody knows quite a bit about this, and he's been able to help me answer so many questions about tension on quilting machines, and I know he'll be able to answer a lot of your questions as well.
When we're talking about tension, we want to make sure that we're pulling that knot into the center of your quilt. And so you have your knot that you're tying. And so if you have your knot and you're sitting on top, you have your tension too tight, or if it's too low, it's really important that you check those different items and that you can be able to see and look at your quilt throughout it as you're changing. Every time you change your bobbin, you want to be looking at those different details. And so it's really important that you guys get a good stitch and you understand kind of what good tension is to make sure that your fabric is getting pulled together tight and that your knots aren't going to come unraveled. So we're going to look at one of the important things when you're first getting started is to make sure you have practice fabric on the side of your quilt. When I use practice fabric, I always like to have the same batting material for my fabric as my pieced quilt that I'm going to be working on. So when I start working on a practice fabric on the side of my quilt, it's important that you have the same. So when you set your tension on your sewing machine, that it's going to be quilting the exact same from when you go from your practice quilt to your pieced quilt. So that way you get the same beautiful stitches So that way you can see the same textures, the same stitch size, and you have the same tension. One of the important things that you do when you're first getting started, just some good quick tips, is to make sure that you are using the same type of thread on both your top and bottom of your fabric. So that way your bottom is filled with the same type of material as your top thread. They don't necessarily have to be the same color, but if you're first getting started, it also helps if they're the same color. But again, they don't have to be, but it does help. So that way you're not having to fight with your tension as much. It does help though, if they're the same material, it will make it so that knot can pull evenly, and it's a lot easier to get that knot in the middle. Again, it doesn't require that you use the same material top and bottom, but you will have to make more adjustments than like the quick tips and stuff that we share with like our instructions. And you'll have to make more adjustments in your bobbin case, and your top thread tension will take a little bit more time to get perfect tension. Wherewith if you're using the same material on top and bottom, like a 50 weight cotton thread, in your bobbin case, it'll help to use a 50 weight cotton thread on your top thread, and they'll just make it a little bit easier. Another important key item when it comes to that is you have to use the correct needle. There's a different needle size for your different thread types and sizes. So if you have a 50 weight cotton thread, you need to be using a size 16 needle. But if you're using like a 40 weight cotton thread, you should be using a size 18 needle. And so it's really important that you start looking into that, and you make sure that you check it online to see what needle size you should be using with your thread size. There's also a quick table that we have on our reference cards that we send with each of our machines that will tell you what needle size you should be using with each thread size. Another thing that's important to be looking at is your stitch length. You'll get a different texture when you're using different stitch lengths. And so when you're doing that, I do check on my practice fabric. If you have that same correct batting size and you set your stitch length, you'll be able to look at that texture and choose which size stitch length you want for setting your texture or creating the texture you want or look that you want on your quilt. So let's go through and just demonstrate a quick couple of things on how to get started with it. When you're quilting, you want to make sure that your bobbin is threaded correctly and installed the correct orientation. So when I thread my bobbin, you make sure that you get it inside the thread tensioner. You pull it up, and see, like this one is a little bit too tight because it's pulling out of my hand. So you want to make sure when you're rolling your bobbin case up, you pick it up, and if it's coming out of your hand at all, it's a little bit too tight. It really should just be rocking up and staying in your hand as you pull it up. So I'm going to use, actually I often will use our hopping foot height gauge to adjust the tension on our bobbin case. And that fits just perfectly right into that tensioner screw there. And you can just adjust that tension right there. And make sure that that tension is rocking up, but not, if it's too loose, it will just be pulling up and not rocking up in your hand. So it's really important that you get that tension set correctly in your bobbin case. That's the first step that I usually do when I'm setting my tension from our quilting machines. The next important step is when you're installing your bobbin case into your machine. I like to hold the thread to the left side as I install it into the machine. And I don't pull the lever out, so that way I can hear it click when I install it into our quilting machine. So I hold that thread off to the left side, and I will install it while holding that thread so it doesn't get caught in any of the levers or inside the hook assembly, and that way it won't get caught up or tied in anything. Next thing I like to do when we're threading our machines is I'll often pull out our reference cards and double check that I'm threading our machines correctly, especially when you're first getting started. That way you get through every single thread guide that you're supposed to. It is critical that you go through every single guide. If you want less tension and you skip one, or if you skip one, you'll get less tension, and cause some issues. It's really important when you're threading your machine that you go inside these tension discs. I will always pull the discs apart when I'm threading the machine to make sure that it's going all the way inside the tension discs. And then I pull it down through the check spring, and then I make sure that that check spring is moving, and then pull it back up when I thread the machine. And wrap it around. And then as I pull that thread, you want to make sure that your check spring is moving up and down when you're pulling it through. And as long as that's happening, you should be able to control your tension with just the machine tension knob now, since we've already set our bobbin case tension. I'm struggling to get in the needle here through. We got it. All right, now we're going to do some practice tensioning or practice stitching on the side of our quilt here to set the tension on our machine to walk that through. It's important when you first are starting quilting also, make sure you pull your bobbin thread up. So that way you don't have your tails on the bottom of your quilt. And so I'll pull it up, make sure that I've got my bobbin thread up, and then I'll stitch in the same location. And make sure that we got both encoders plugged in, because we don't. And then we can go ahead and start quilting. Got the stitch size just a little high here. So we can see here when I first start quilting, we're a little bit too loose on our top thread tension. We're getting some railroad tracks here on the bottom of our thread. And so if you rotate, and I always look at the bottom of my quilt as often as possible to be able to look at the bottom of the fabric, and we can see that our stitches are laying on top of our stitches on the bottom here. So we want to actually rotate the tensioner clockwise, so that way we're going bigger numbers, so it's rotating around. And when I first am getting started, I'll do about half turn rotations, if not full turn rotations, depending on how loose or tight the tension looks. And so based on that, we were getting some railroad tracks, so we're going to go about a full half turn, and then we're going to double check it again. Making just some fine adjustments as we go. Got the tension correct. I'm just going to loosen it just a little bit more there. And now we got a proper stitch there on the bottom. So that's one of the important things that I like to look at, is making sure that you get your tension correct, the stitch size correct, your needle correct, and you're choosing the correct thread materials. Some good basic areas when you're getting started with quilting.
So a couple questions for you, Cody. On that knob, I noticed that there's some numbers on the side of it. What do those numbers mean?
Those numbers are a reference place for you to use on your machine. So every time you change thread, you need to reset your tension. And so if you have that, and you can write down where you last used, if say like I have a 40 weight cotton thread, but then I'm moving to a 50 weight polyester thread, I can write down and be like, oh, I'm changing threads. I can know that when I start next time with the 40 weight cotton thread, it's good to start about at 2.5 on that tension dial when you're lining up the bottom of the knob with those numbers. And that's really helpful to be able to get started and use that as a reference guide for you on your machine, and help you have a starting point every time you change to a new thread. Again, when you change to a bob, or also if you change your bobbin thread, you want to also make sure that you reset your tension and redo that test where you're pulling it out of your hand if you're using a different type or size of thread.
Gotcha. Cool. One other question I had, would it be a tension problem? And I've had a customer ask me this actually. If the machine isn't pulling the bobbin thread out, is that a tension problem? Is that a threading problem? What would that be?
It can be either. It's probably not a tension problem unless it's really tight, but it's more likely either something's not threaded correctly, or your bobbin case, the loop is not long enough. That's a really common issue if your tail is just not coming out long enough, or it's caught in the lever on your bobbin case. If there's other issues, if you just keep fighting it and you have your tail and you get everything properly set up, you might want to call our Grace Company tech support team. They're really helpful, and they'll be able to help walk you through and see what else is going on with your machine. Those are the base things that I would look at, though. The needle being installed correctly. We'll go through a few more steps, I guess. The needle being installed correctly, because if you have it rotate around backwards, it's not going to pull the bobbin thread up. If your bobbin thread is not threaded correctly, that's going to cause you some issues. If your needle's not all the way in your sewing machine, that will cause you some issues. If it's not up all the way, if you just changed your needle and now it's not pulling your thread up, make sure that you loosen that needle again and push it all the way up into your machine. That will be really helpful when you're going through it. And that your machine is threaded correctly. If it's like not going through your thread take-up lever, it's not going to pull the thread to be able to pull up that knot. How often do you need to change needles? I change needles every time I do a new quilt. But also, if you ever start running into tension problems or something like that, then I will look and check my needle. I'll take it out of the machine. I put it on a flat table and see if it's bent or warped at all. And if it's not, then I feel the tip of it to see if there's a burr. If it is, then I replace the needle. If not, I'll put it back in the machine and see if there's something else that is wrong with the machine. But that's the general thumb I usually use, is I just do it when I start a new project. You don't need to change it that often. I think a needle would be able to go through 3 quilts pretty easily, but I will often just change it every time just to make sure that I am starting fresh when I start a new quilt, because I don't want to ruin my pieced top.
Cool. One other question I just thought of, actually, Cody, this machine, it's here. We know it's in pretty good condition. Say I haven't used my machine in a while. It's been a minute since I've done a project. I've been piecing one. How long does the whole, testing on a separate piece of fabric, how long does that process usually take you?
I will just do it until I have everything set correctly, and I make sure that I get the tension and colors and everything picked out that I want. I like to practice on the side of my quilt, either with small squares. I'll just make my pieced quilt a little bit, the backing and batting a lot bigger than my pieced quilt, and then just use either some squares that I can put on the side of my quilt or lay some fabric on the side of it so I can be matching my colors. And so when I choose my colors, when I get the tension set and I get the texture I want correct, that's when I move on to my pieced top.
Cool. Well, it sounds like it's something that could take a minute, and it's such a good idea to have a separate piece of fabric for that to happen on. Love that.
Yeah. I think that's the important thing that I really want to make sure people understand, is it's really good to practice and make sure that you're starting on something that you didn't spend 100 hours piecing together, to make sure that you're not going to have to pick something out of it, because that's always a little bit painful.
Yeah, for sure.
I've spent a lot of time picking, and it is not my favorite thing.
Yeah.
I made a quick acronym that I can share with you guys that I think is pretty fun, that for getting started when you're first learning to quilt, some important tips that you can be able to use for the word tension. First is T for thread. Double check that you have the correct thread top and bottom. It's really important that you use the correct thread, especially if you're getting started, that you're using like threads. Next is E for equipment. Make sure that you have your equipment double checked, that you have your machine threaded correctly and your bobbin case threaded correctly, and that they're installed with your bobbin case all the way in, and that you double check your reference cards that everything is correct. Next is your needle. I always check my needles and make sure that you have the needle installed correctly. Even experienced quilters I've seen very often install the needles the wrong direction or just a little bit crooked. We actually have a needle magnet that you can use to help you install that correctly. I'll show you guys in a second how to use that. And the next is the stitch. To make sure that you get the stitch that you want before you start on your piece top, that you practice on the side of your quilt. And then also double check your information. Double check that your needle is the correct size for your thread, and that you got the correct tension settings that you want for your machine, that your bobbin case is set in correct tension, and you have everything set. So you double check all your information. And then O is for opposite. Always check the opposite side of your quilt. It's very important. I've a couple times installed a bobbin and the tail was caught inside the lever, and then I started getting eyelashes. So it's really important that you often check the opposite side of your fabric, and so that way you can know and see what's going on and make sure that your tension is still correct even after you've changed your bobbin. And then the next one is new bobbin. Make sure that every time you replace your bobbin, you check your tension. I go to my practice fabric every bobbin change. Make sure that my tension is not changed. It's just a quick stitch, and then I'll double check both top and bottom and make sure it is still correct. I oil my machine every other bobbin change. I will oil the hook assembly and make sure when I do oil my machine that I run the machine around a little bit without the bobbin case in it, so that way I don't get any oil on my thread. Because if you get a little bit of oil on your thread, it can sometimes cause some tension issues. So I'll oil my machine every other bobbin change, and then I run my machine without the bobbin case in it and without thread in the machine, because you also don't want your machine threaded when you're running it like that. And I run it around just a little bit, make sure that the oil gets out. And then when I'm oiling the head of my machine, I only oil that about once every 100 hours or 3 months. When I clean the bobbin case, I will clean it with our lint brush, but sometimes I actually use a needle also to be able to clean the tensioner. You can, if it's not threaded, when I clean my bobbin case, there's, the tension arm on your bobbin case. You can slide your needle inside of that, and I just slide it underneath to make sure that there's no lint inside of there. Then I'll also brush the inside of my bobbin case. I take the needle plate off at probably every other quilt also, and brush the inside of my hook assembly and brush the inside of that whole bobbin area to make sure that there's no extra lint or things inside of there. So that way you're not going to run into any troubles, because lint and buildup and oil can start causing you some tension issues or just some thread breaking issues I've seen with a couple of machines. So just make sure that you clean your hook assembly area and your bobbin case fairly regularly. I also, when I start a new project, when we're talking about cleaning, I will clean my track system regularly. It's really important to wipe down your tracks and your encoders so you don't get any stitching issues, because it really does help to have clean tracks, clean hooks, clean bobbins, and clean tension assemblies. When you're cleaning your machines, those are the areas that I hit probably every other quilt. It won't cause you any issues if you oil your machine too much. I try not to oil my machine too much because I don't want oil to be dripping down ever. We do have oil wicks inside the machines to be able to catch that oil, but it is helpful just to you only really need about 2 drops every 100 hours or every 3 months, or if it's been sitting out for like 3 months, then you oil it. But if you put too much in there, just make sure you run your machine for a little bit, so that way you're not going to get any oil drip down onto your quilts.
Gotcha. And then I know yesterday when we were talking about this briefly, you mentioned something about the fabric tension. Is fabric tension very important, and do side clips come into that at all?
Yes, your fabric tension is very important. If your fabric tension is actually too tight and you pull your quilt off your machine, your fabric is going to pucker, and you're going to get a bunch of issues with that. It will also affect your tension just a little bit when you pull it off of your machine. So I like to, if you can bounce a penny off of it, is kind of how I usually talk about it. It's too tight. You don't want it so tight that you can bounce a penny off of it. Like if you dropped it onto it, it should just fall flat. And so that's kind of the analogy that I really like to use when we're talking about fabric tension, is it shouldn't be able to be so tight that you're going to bounce something off it, but it's just pulled where it's flat.
Cool. And then what do you clean? The encoders and the track and all that stuff that you mentioned, paper towels, Clorox wipes?
I usually use a cloth.
Okay.
Just like a cloth rag. And I will usually use like some dust spray, actually. When I spray it down, I spray it onto my cloth, and then I'll wipe down the tracks and the wheels, and the encoder wheel are the important things that I like to clean. Cool. Those are some of the important ones that I like to
What about canned air? That's another question I have, because I've cleaned a sewing machine with canned air. Is that the same thing for a
Same thing. Machine? Yep. You can clean the inside of your hook area with canned air. I really think that's super helpful. We do that actually here sometimes. So It's not going to hurt your machine. It's super safe to do. And it's just a quick, easy way to clean your hook area. When you use your needle magnet, you just put it on the front of your needle and make sure that it is pointing out. So if you have a longer lever arm, it'll help you be able to see that your needle is incorrect. The front of your needle is actually flat. And so you can just put a needle magnet on the front of your needle, and it will help show you that the orientation is correct by having that leveraged arm out. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate being able to spend time with you guys today. I've had a lot of fun. I hope you guys learned a few things from us today, and hope if you guys have any issues that we'll be able to, or you'll be able to get through them, and have a nice.
Hello. Well, that was just wonderful. Thank you so much, Grace team. Thank you, Cody, for walking us through some of the best practices and the things you've done that have worked well. I just wanted to pull up for us on the screen the acronym again, right? There it is. Thread, equipment, needle, stitch, information, opposite, new bobbin. That is definitely something I'm going to be implementing for myself. I'm going to be writing it down and memorizing what all of the things mean. Oh, that is a really a nifty trick to keep track of all the things that could be happening with your machine. So, again, thank you so much for joining us. Looking to see if there's any comments. I don't see any comments or questions at the moment. So I will look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning is when our next presentation is. It is the wonderful presentation, Fun with Feathers by Lizzie Allen. So I am so excited to learn how to do feathers. I love feathers on quilting, and I am excited to learn how to do feathers. My feathers are a little sad at the moment, so I'm hoping Lizzie Allen has some great tips and tricks. So that's going to be 8 o'clock tomorrow. We've got the Baby Bubble Quilt presentation that happens at noon tomorrow Mountain Time. That's with Carla. And then we end off, our last presentation is You Can Quilt Super Slide Ruler with Leah Day at 4 o'clock Mountain Time. So those are what we have coming up tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.